Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. And today, this is another in the series that I call the Communio interviews. For those of you who maybe don't know, I'm on the board of Communio, as is Rodney Howsare, my friend who is to my left here. And I'm also the official podcaster for Communio International Catholic Review. As I've said before, I'm not entirely certain what perks and benefits come with being the official Communio podcaster, or even what it means. Rodney and I were joking. By the way, our guest today is David Schindler. We'll get to that in a second. All right. But Rodney and I were joking before the show that we should just, because we're both Luddites and we don't know what we're doing, that we should just rename this Gaudium et Spes podcast as, theologians, Luddite theologians wandering around or something. Like take kind of a spin
Using
on
technology.
use a spin on Jerry Seinfeld's show. What's it called? Comedians driving around and drinking coffee. I think that's the name of his Netflix show. So yeah, Luddite theologians wandering around. But anyway, I this is an official Communio interview, and so Rodney and I do have the pleasure today of hosting a dear old friend, as well as, in our opinion, one of the leading Catholic intellectual voices in the world today, and that is David C. Schindler. And David C. Schindler is professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the John Paul II Institute for Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies of Marriage and Family. And he's also the PhD program advisor down there. And David got his MA and PhD at Catholic University of America. He's got an MTL from the Pontifical JPII Institute and a BA from Notre Dame. So you're a domer. So yes.
Yeah.
Yes. My
Go
wife
Irish.
is.
Yeah. It's exciting season for the football team.
That's right. And as a Nebraska fan myself, it is yet another year of misery, another year of horrific frustration. This too shall pass. But anyway, the article that we're going to be, by the way, welcome, Dave. Welcome, Dave, to the show.
Thank you. Yeah.
And of course, Rodney, you're welcome too.
The Penn State fan, I understand, right?
Oh, yes. Penn State
yeah.
is in the playoff. Notre Dame's in the play. Is there any chance Notre Dame and Penn State could end up playing each other? I guess.
I think there could be towards the end, not in the next couple games, but
yeah, we'll see.
I think we could realistically win our first two.
Yeah.
I remember, since my wife is a graduate of Notre Dame, then back in the days when Nebraska was like the Alabama of its day, Nebraska and Notre Dame had a home and home series. She and I had to watch games from separate rooms because fortunately Nebraska won both games, which made our household a little tense for a few days. Anyway, enough chitter chatter. We're going to be discussing, it's in the very next issue of Communio. It's not out yet. So stay tuned. If you're not a subscriber to Communio, you should be a subscriber. But anyway, the article that David has written is Fulfilling the Law of the Gift, an essay as the principle of agere in Karol Wojtyła's Anthropology. Now that's a mouthful, right? An essay as the principle of agere, but it actually begins with, the interesting part is actually fulfilling the law of the gift. And that will be out in the next issue. And now whenever the people, the powers that be, those people at Communio, the powers that be at Communio send me the list of upcoming authors and articles, and I get to choose who I'm going to interview. I chose this article for two reasons. Number one, the first and foremost, because it gave me a chance to interview you again. You're an old friend, and it's been a long time since we'd interview, but also because I am interested. I was so happy to see an article upcoming in Communio that is not just an exposition of the thought of John Paul II, but a defense of his thought, because it does. One of the main reasons I chose this article and wanted to unpack it was because there is, it seems to me, a concerted effort to undermine the legacy of John Paul II, both from the right and the left. I mean, the left hates him because they say he doesn't take subjectivity and lived experience seriously enough. And the right hates him because he takes subjectivity and lived experience seriously. So at least the right understands that he did take subjectivity and lived experience seriously, which they hate. And so there is this very worrisome sort of tarnishing of John Paul's legacy, or at least an attempt to tarnish it. And we don't necessarily have to get down in those weeds, but just explaining my motivation as to one of the reasons why I think this is a very, very important article indeed. And Rodney, you can chime in whatever you want. I'm sure you've also read the article. I sent you the PDF, and we can go from there. And I just want to begin, David, with your beginning, which is you say that, and I quote, "There is without a doubt no word in the work of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, that gathers up the core concern of his thought more than gift, or perhaps even more fully expressed, self-gift." So maybe you could unpack that just a little bit for us.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's first of all, let me say that was helpful for you to say why you wanted to talk about this. I totally agree with you about the Vergessenheit of John Paul II and Vatican II these days. I mean, there's people are concerned about very important things and for very good reasons. So I don't want to malign any intentions, but it is striking to see how the perspective on the Vatican II has changed over the last 20 years. There was, a fairly sizable group that recognized this as a renewal of the church. And I apologize if I'm going over themes that you've probably discussed.
Oh no, please go.
But,
you go.
Yes. But that there was a sizable group of theologians, philosophers, Catholics who came to really love Vatican II and love the church through what was opened up through Vatican II, and saw John Paul II and then eventually Benedict XVI as the shepherds guiding us to a proper meaning. And these were people that were conservative. One has to be careful using these words these days. Everything is so political. And polarized, but that love the tradition of the church. And regrettably, in the last couple of decades, those who really love the tradition of the church have been growing more and more skeptical of Vatican II for reasons that we all know. And I think that's misguided. Again, the concern is a real one, and there is, in a certain sense, for Catholics, nothing more important than the tradition, properly understood. But a tradition that stops at a certain point isn't actually tradition, and it's actually a betrayal of tradition to try to freeze it at a certain point. By saying this, I don't mean to be defending. So many people will use that sort of line of thought to defend a kind of progressivism, and I don't mean that in the least. I mean, I think if anybody has read anything I've written, they know that I'm not a big fan of modernity and so forth. But I see that the fruits, the way that the Vatican II and John Paul II have made available to us the living tradition is absolutely essential as we go forward. And the fact that this is really being cast aside because of fears and anger and outrage about things that warrant a reaction, certainly. It's just tragic. It's really tragic. And one of the things I think is a precious mission of Communio is to hold on to the whole tradition in the midst of all of this political fighting, but to stay true to the tradition. And John Paul II, those of us who grew up, for me, he was the Pope. And I mean, in a certain sense, whenever I think of the Pope, it's John Paul II. It's just hard not to think of him.
Hey, not to interrupt, but my first year in seminary, 1978, was the year he got elected. And I cannot tell you how inspiring, he was.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so, but he wrote, I mean, it's not as if we've sort of seen everything that John Paul II has to give, and it's turned out to be, only marginally significant or useful, and now it's time to move on to other things. I mean, that's just not the case. He bequeathed such a treasure to the church, and just an extraordinary amount of incredibly, I mean, the combination of profound insight, philosophically informed insight, with a heart that is so completely devoted to the church and to Christ through Mary and so forth. I mean, that is, he remains a source. So I think I'm grateful to the institute here that's going to be publishing over the next decades the collected works of Wojtyła, John Paul II in English, and that's going to take a long time because he wrote such an extraordinarily large amount. And because it's such a huge body of work, it's always helpful to find the thought or the notion that lies at the center.
What's the leitmotif?
Yeah, the leitmotif. Yeah, and I don't know that I would say this is the only one, but it's certainly at the core, the notion of gift and self-gift. And so I thought it would be worthwhile reflecting on it. This was a paper was originally given at a conference that the Institute was hosting to announce the beginning of the collected works that began with the publication of Person and Act. So that was the occasion for this. But it seemed to me that gift was a way to get a nice orientation into his work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to what you said before we move any further into the article, where you talked about there is just so much about his intellectual legacy that we haven't even begun to retrieve. And sadly, right now, there's almost this strange perspective. Perhaps it's the downside of a kind of elevated sense of the papacy, ironically or paradoxically, that it's almost like, well, he was Pope for a while, he had his day, and now it's over. And now we're on to the next Pope. My friend Kevin Clay says the trouble with popes is that they die. And what he means by that is, you can be the greatest Pope in history, but then the next Pope comes along, and if your view of the papacy is he's the oracle on the Tiber, then you have a papal positivism. Then you really do have this sense in which, well, okay, that was John Paul is yesterday's papacy, yesterday's news, and that's an extremely horrible view of tradition, for starters, and the magisterium, but also then, of just the sheer depth and profundity of this man's thought.
Yeah, no, that's right, and it's a betrayal even just of human existence. I mean, we, that this idea that we don't that history doesn't bear fruit in figures like this.
Yeah. Rodney, did you want to add anything before we move on to getting to the article a little bit?
Yeah, just a couple of notes along these preliminary thoughts, which I think are really helpful to set up the article, actually, right? The one would just be that, there are forgettable popes, right? I mean, in history, there are, the preponderance of them have probably been somewhat forgettable. And we can think of the handful that were actually really important thinkers and did really important things to, develop doctrine and things like that. It's extremely unlikely that John Paul II is one of those forgettable popes, right? So I think history will bear that out. But it would be a tragedy if we missed that opportunity to tap into what he did. But the second thing that came to mind as David was talking is precisely along these lines of Vatican II and the reception of Vatican II and John Paul II and Benedict. When I was coming into the church, it was the days of John Paul II giving over to the days of Benedict, and I was a huge fan of both, and it's one of the reasons I came into the church was precisely what made John Paul II so sort of quasi-evangelical, if you will, enthusiastic about the faith, if I could just put it that way, and not just like, well, here's the stuff that we have to believe, we're going to plop it on you and require you to follow it, whether you like it or not. There's a sense in which John Paul II really believed that this is going to make you happy if you embrace this, right? This is really going to fulfill you. And so that's my second comment, which could lead into the chapter, I think, is just Humanae Vitae was not received well.
Yeah.
It was like just the master of understatement, right? So like a lead balloon. And I've always seen the work of John Paul II as a way of justifying and defending and placing on a really kind of amazing, almost existential foundation, the teaching of Humanae Vitae. Yeah. And it seems to me that, David, when I was reading your article, you bring that across, because it has to be the case that what is being asked of us in Humanae Vitae is something that really deep down in our bodies and in our essence is really something we want. Right, it has to be something that fulfills us in a way, and it's not just some heteronomous law that we're going to grin and bear it. Which is, I think, the Catholicism leading up to the council, a lot of it, I think, was just hoping and praying the church would lift the ban, so to speak, right? And what is that like? You're just like, the only reason I'm following this teaching is because I have to. And I really think it's refreshing to think of John Paul II as the guy who's trying to fix that problem, if you will.
Yeah, I remember when I studied under Germain Grisey, him saying something very similar, and where he said, Germain, the great defender of Humanae Vitae, said, the problem with Humanae Vitae is the apparatus is very thin apparatus. It needed some fleshing out. Right. And do you believe that John Paul fleshed it out? Yeah. And anyway, I interrupted you, Dave. You were about to say something.
Well, no, that's it is interesting. I mean, a couple of points that he's right. Actually, Grisey is right about the thin apparatus. I mean, that was back when encyclicals used to be very short. And yeah, exactly. And the principle articulated, there's no exposition. It's so brief and concise and just states the principle. There's a certain wisdom and prudence in doing that the magisterium is not theological. It's meant to sort of bear the fruit of theological insight. But not theological in the speculative sense. But I mean, it did need some fleshing out, and that's exactly, I think, one of the things you could identify as a gift that John Paul II gave to the church was to provide the anthropological foundations for Humanae Vitae, and that was clearly something that was really important to him, and he it's one of these sort of fortuitous accidents of the history of the church. Some might call it providence, that you had a philosopher who was placed in the chair of Peter, as my dad always used to say. It's the first infallible philosopher in history, and that's what's interesting too is, and that's one of the things that prompted this essay is that the anthropology also reflects a metaphysics. And John Paul II did not do metaphysics in any sort of sustained, direct way. But this to me is a sign of a profoundly Catholic thinker. So often when somebody doesn't do something, they make arguments for why that's not important or not necessary. But I think the beauty of the church is, when we recognize our particular roles, and some of us are the knees, some the feet, some the fingers, some the nose, that we also recognize that we belong to a body, and so we can actually affirm the importance of these other dimensions that are beyond us. And I think that he does that in a beautiful way. He points to the importance of metaphysics in a really profound and insightful way, even if he doesn't elaborate it. But it sort of sets it up. And that was kind of what, the concern going into this essay.
Oh yeah, and he even his intellectual interests were so wide ranging. I remember, was it Fides et Ratio where he tossed out the name of Rosmini
Yeah,
as somebody that we should? I remember reading that, going, "Holy, my goodness!" I mean, I had been years since I had read Rosmini, and it was like, wow. But I kind of like, I don't always agree with him, but I thought, well, that's just so interesting that John Paul would have thrown his name out there.
that's right. I mean, he was such a widely read in different genres, of course, literature and
Yeah.
poetry.
All right, well, let's get into the article a bit more, which is on, this whole notion of gift. And I agree with you. I'm not as well read in John Paul's writings as you are. I've basically, and I've taught them, Rodney has too, the encyclicals. I tried reading The Acting Person once,
Yeah.
and I got about 100 pages in, 80 pages, and thought, no, I'm not going to finish. So that's another reason why I think this is a good article to act as a baseline, and maybe some others as well can follow, because I think that's the experience of a lot of people.
Yeah. No, that's true, and it's interesting you mentioned. So you said The Acting Person. So you're referring to the original translation, which
yeah,
is impossible. I mean, just I
yes,
remember even Ken Schmitz saying in print that that book would never be read if it hadn't been written by the man who became John Paul II. And I wonder, I don't know that he would still say that. So for the collected works, the Institute had a former student, a graduate, Grzegorz Ignacek, who is Polish, as you can tell by my bad pronunciation, who undertook the translation. And I think it's still a very difficult book, but at least it makes sense now in ways that the first translation just did not.
yeah. I remember reading it and thinking this must be a bad translation, and I showed it to a friend of mine who was Polish, Zenon Bushnek, and he was a theologian, and he read it, parts of it, and he goes, "Oh yeah, this is a terrible translation." So it's another reason why I kind of quit reading. But anyway, you focus in on this notion of self gift in particular, and pertinent to this whole conversation, of course, is this broader conversation that's been going on for quite a while now about the concept of relationality,
Yeah.
and the concept of whether it's a transcendental property of being, is it grounded in Trinitarian kenosis, kenosis, all these Balthasarian sorts of themes, and then you get then a notion, you see it even in Ratzinger, of personhood being constitutively tied to the notion of self-divestment, self-gift, and all that. But clearly, as you lay it out here, Wojtyła is in that school of thought, and it's one I agree with. And yet, you mentioned at the very beginning that there was like this written symposium on love and what was it, love and responsibility? Yeah,
Yes.
and that Father Carol Meissner raised some objections to this notion of self gift and relationality being so deeply constitutive of human personhood. And Rodney, you can chime in and you can piggyback on that question as well. But maybe you can begin here, David, and sort of unpack what that controversy was about.
Right. Well, there are actually two dimensions of the controversy. So more generally, you have the controversy about to what extent is relation, what's the ontological status of relation? And that's a really important question, because from a traditional, and by traditional here, I mean, Aristotelian um, uh, current, according to the sort of a more sort of traditional substance metaphysics grounded in Aristotle's thought, relation is just one of the accidents
Yeah.
in the categories. And the question then is, does this sense of relation being an accident to a substance, a more fundamentally established substance, does that really do justice to the specifically Christian insight into the importance of love and the meaning of person, and a notion of God as Trinity and so forth. It seems undeniable that Christian revelation brings a new significance to relationality. And so one of these great questions is this one place where the Aristotelian metaphysics doesn't quite suffice? And you have, on the one side, a number of people. You mentioned Ratzinger very famously in his interpretation of the meaning of person. A lot of times this is tied up in how you interpret what a person is, in part because of the Trinitarian persons. This was a theme my father got very deeply involved in from a much more sort of basically metaphysical perspective. You have people like Norris Clark, and then on the flip side, those that have consistently defended an Aristotelian perspective, and interpreted Aquinas in terms of these Aristotelian categories, that want to insist on retaining this sort of relatively secondary status to relation, but try to argue that nevertheless one can make that more interesting than it sounds, and so forth. That's kind of a general sketch. Mikhail Waldstein is someone he's a complex here, because in one respect he's very sympathetic with John Paul II, obviously, as the translator of theology of the body. Yeah, but having come from a more sort of standard Aristotelian Thomistic background, so he and my father were in a lot of debate about that. So that's one, and then the second one, and I'll be brief about this because I think we'll unfold dimensions, specifically around the thought of Wojtyła / John Paul II, and in the stream of personalism, you have this question about the relative priority of receptivity and generosity in self-gift. Or one way to put it is, which comes first? Do we possess ourselves in order to be able to give ourselves, or do we? Is self-possession the foundation for self-gift, or is self-gift the foundation for self-possession? Is it the case that it's precisely in giving myself that I come properly to possess myself? And that's a mysterious, but you see that, that's a big debate.
That's why you have esse and agere in the title, the old scholastic axiom. What is it? Action flows from being. Isn't that what it is? Right. If I'm getting my Latin correct, I don't know. I'm getting
it's agere sequitur esse.
That's right. That's what I'm groping after. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm getting feeble in my old age. Rodney, do you want, before we move on in the article, did you have a question or a comment on what Dave just said?
Just maybe before we move past that very first preliminary point, then, is it seems to me, David, what you're arguing for is, so it seems like at least some of the critics of John Paul II were saying it's kind of either or. You either make a gift of yourself, or you possess yourself. You're incommunicable.
I want to interrupt 1 second, and also the idea that either or involves a transactional understanding of things. Anyway, back to you, Rodney.
That's absolutely right. And it seems to me that, David, what you're arguing for is a kind of almost a more paradoxical understanding of what it means to possess oneself and what it means to give oneself. So maybe just unpack that a little, and if you
would. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the. I mean, in a way, that's what I didn't. I tend to find texts more successful, things that I write more successful, if I don't know exactly where I'm going to end up when I start it. Because I'm not just sort of saying something I've already thought, but I'm actually sort of thinking through.
You just described everything I write ever.
Well, and in this case, I wanted to sort of put him to the test, because I had myself wondered whether there were some things, and I referred to them. It's sort of the starting point for the essay. Some objections that were raised, and it seemed to me initially that Wojtyła wanted to downplay the significance, the ontological significance of self-gift and relationality, and in ways that I thought that maybe Balthasar and Ferdinand Ulrich and others would be able to correct. So I came into it wanting to sort of test that, and I was really surprised to see that some of the assumptions that had been made were just ill-founded, and that he has a far richer sense of, yeah. So I mean, psychologically speaking, people will often say things like, you need to love yourself in order to love somebody else. You first have to love yourself. And of course, there's actually something really profoundly true and important about that. Um, and that becomes visible when you just consider the alternative. If you have somebody who loves other people precisely because he hates himself, has a certain self-contempt, invariably he hates others too, and you end up using other people to fill these needs so obviously there's a profound truth to the idea that you have to love yourself in order to love other people. But the flip side of it is, and this is something that I think is less often seen and was a huge theme in my father's thought, is that in fact you learn to love yourself precisely by being the recipient of love from another. Then you think of this is why the experience of the child is so profound. And the child doesn't possess itself first and then love the mother. I mean, and love the father and then the siblings and so forth. But the child is enabled to love himself because he's been received into this love that preceded him. And there you have an example of relationship that precedes substance, right? The child comes to achieves his substance inside of relationship. Now, I actually think this is a little side note, and this is something I'd like to work on some point in the future. But it seems to me that the metaphysical debate about substance and relation always takes, it seems to me, takes as its horizons, or sets as setting the terms, this idea that you have a substance that then relates to something other than itself. And it seems to me it changes, and that's why the Aristotelians are saying, well, you can't have a relationship unless you have something that relates, and there's a logic to that. But it seems to me it changes things if you think that the relation is between the mother and the father, inside of which the child emerges. Then you see there is a profound sense in which the relationship is already there prior to the substance, and that priority gets recapitulated then in the substances coming to itself. I just think that way of thinking about it would open up a whole.
I agree. Yeah, it does, because I mean the substance is precisely the capacity for that reception.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the interesting. And by the way, to go back to the thing about, if you hate yourself, you're going to hate other people. It's also the reverse can be true, that one can learn to hate oneself if one moves into a world in which one is first hated.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the analogy still, and by the way, Balthasar built an entire ontology off that whole thing about the phenomenology of the mother's smile provoking self-identity out of the child. I talked to a child psychologist once who said, yeah, a child looks at its hand and sees a hand in the air and never says, oh, that's my hand.
Yeah.
that as far as the child is concerned, his hand is the same as everything is simply out there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So the child has to come to achieve a certain kind of self-consciousness, and that achievement occurs through the mother smiles at the child until this child and one day can smile back.
Yeah. And as anybody knows who's had kids, this is precisely the vicious turn that a child takes at about age 2 or 3 when they suddenly discover, wait a minute, I'm me.
That's right. Well, but I mean, that's really interesting. So you see that the no comes later.
Yes.
In most cases, my eldest son, he kind of started with the no, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, it comes later. So you then distinguish yourself after already having been in relation. So I mean, I think phenomenologically speaking, and then I think one can give a metaphysical interpretation of this. The priority of relationship is I think demonstrable in that way.
Well, yeah, and oh, go ahead, Rodney.
No, I just want to just one last point on that. I think that's super interesting. It's so when you look at the question of substance and relation in the context of thinking about persons, which it seems to me in the hierarchy of being, I mean, this is the top of the metaphysical rung, right? At least in this world, right? So, so in the created order that we experience in this world, that's the highest expression of being. And the fact that human beings come into the world as children is extremely interesting because you're at a state of almost pure potency when you pop out of the womb. It's not like you have a sense of self and then, okay, I'm going to relate to these people around me. You have no sense of self almost at all, which you precisely gain by absolutely almost opening yourself up to whoever happens to be looking you in the eye. You know, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to extend that point, my colleague Margie McCarthy here has often points to a text by Adolf Portman. Does that name ring a
Yes.
bell?
Yeah.
He was the biologist that was connected with Balthasar's circle in Basel. He was a zoologist and very interested in animals, but he points to the difference between for instance, a colt, a horse. You know, maybe I could use goats as an example, Larry, because
Yes.
just talking
Or,
about picking your goats up. Yeah.
yeah.
But he said, you know, it's for a horse. I mean, it takes about a couple of minutes for it to be able to walk on its own, and the idea is that it's actually already been basically formed in the womb. It just needs to stretch its legs. Whereas with human beings, in a way, the womb stage extends into, you know, birth and living in the world. And what that means is that one's, you know, activity and personal interaction and relation actually gets into the very birthing process. And I mean, ontologically speaking, that's a way of showing that this personal relationship actually enters into the very ontological depths. It's not something that presupposes a completed adult.
Yeah,
in the way that animals do.
well, you see this in animals as you go up the scale of intelligence, you want to put it that way, then it takes longer and longer and longer. It's very interesting. Balthasar is a thing where, you know, he talks about that the higher capacity for self immanence means that it's going to take you longer to finally sort of turn out. And that's all that's, you know, who writes a lot about this too in the birth experience and the phenomenology of it is this French dude, Emmanuel Falk. He writes some interesting, I was just reading it. It's very dense writer, very dense.
He's one of the great Catholic philosophers right now in France.
And are you familiar with his thought at all? I find him fascinating.
I have not explored it in depth. I've read titles and kind of read around, but
Jennifer Martin turned me onto him. So I thought, well, and Jenny knows everything. So anyway, I want to what was the specific then criticism of Father Meissner towards John Paul's notion of self-gift? If memory serves from reading your article, it was like, well, we can't give ourselves to another human being because we belong to God or something along those lines. And go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's I mean the gist of it. If you want to, and there was another another colleague who raised some criticism. The gist of it is, you know, twofold, really, right? One is that it offends human dignity to belong to another. That human beings are defined by the, you know, sui juris alteri incommunicabilis. So, you know, the very fact that you are autonomous, sui juris means, you know, that's another way of saying autonomy, and incommunicable, so that you can't communicate yourself to another. So that's one thing that it would seem to be the precise undermining of personhood, to be able to, because gift implies a transfer of ownership. So to make a self-gift, you know, we tend to use it in a kind of a sentimental way. Gift of self, you know, you put yourself in every card that you write or something at Christmas time. You know, but that's only in a very analogous sense a gift of self. Like a proper gift of self, if gift means a transfer of ownership, I mean, that's pretty radical, and that would seem to be denied by the alteri incommunicabilis, that which precisely means that you can't communicate yourself to another. So that would be the one, and then the other more theological one is the one that you mentioned, Larry, which is that we belong only to God, and to give ourselves to another human being in a way is theft with respect to God. So that's the problem he's facing, and I mean, you can sort of see the second one with God. You can see the problematic assumptions, I think, pretty clearly.
Well, that goes to the transactional quality to it all, and the problematical concepts of ownership that are sort of involved. There's also, you mentioned in the article, and I can't remember what it is, that the very concept that my identity is in God, and God in a sense owns me, that has its own problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right. But I mean, in both cases, the problem is that you think that you're taking a kind of, you might say, bourgeois notion of ownership. A sort of capitalist view of owners, private property, which is you define property precisely by the exclusion of a relation to the other. And
so,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and Wojtyła, to get to the nub of your sort of initial impression, Wojtyła in this dialogue appears to backtrack and say, "Hey, you guys are right about this," but he's not really saying that, right?
Yeah, no, so that was the impression that I had coming into this. When I looked more closely at the text, I realized it's just not the case. I mean, he can't emphasize more insistently that the gift of self is is rooted in the very nature of one's being, that it's not simply something that you pretend or act out, but that doesn't touch the core of your being. That's clearly not. But what he concedes is just that if it means if belonging to another means that I no longer belong to myself, then yes, I reject it. So that's what he was rejecting, the idea of that I cease to belong to myself, which is to say that I cease to be a person in the act. He says, I want to be very clear, I reject that. And that, it seems to me, is clearly an essential thing to reject. The idea that we would lose our personhood in this, but then it's a much more profound and paradoxical and insightful way of interpreting it. He says that in fact that implies a transactional sense.
Yeah, and you mentioned it in context. It was in the context too of discussing conjugal rights. Yeah, I'm just remembering, when I was reading your article, St. Paul, 1 Corinthians, I believe, chapter 7, goes on. I mean, he beautifully says, basically, dude, your body belongs to your wife. And he says to woman, hey, dudette, your body belongs to him.
Yeah.
All right. So it seems strangely non-transactional. Let's just put it that way.
That's right. Well, I mean, it's real, but that can be interpreted in many ways. Kant has the most extraordinary and sort of horrifying interpretation. I mean, and Waldstein is very good at this, highlighting the absurdity of it. So I mean, for Kant, the reason that doesn't offend your dignity is that when you give yourself to your spouse, is that you already own your spouse.
Yeah. Which is,
and that's why it doesn't offend your dignity. So it'd be like stealing from yourself, by putting it from one hand into the next. But I mean, that's an extraordinary. I mean, and Kant clearly has an allergy to anything profoundly generous.
Yeah, I didn't know that about Kant until Grisey pointed it out to me many, many years ago to make fun of it. But anyway. Rodney, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I mean, and it is in so many terms. It's worth looking up. It's really something.
Yeah, absolutely. Rodney, do you have anything to add before we move on?
No, I mean, I don't like that. I mean, maybe this will take us a little bit off. I don't think it will.
Go ahead.
It's just something to think about. I think even sort of in our experience, I think this kind of just rings true.
Yeah.
That it is this weird thing that it's precisely when you learn to make that gift of yourself, especially in marriage, but in any kind of a vow or any kind of a relationship, that you really also at the same time, in this weird way, feel yourself coming into your own.
Right.
You feel kind of like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to be. Right.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, I taught faith and reason this semester. And at the end of the semester, I totally changed the assignment I had planned and told the students I wanted them to write just a little essay on George MacDonald's fairy tale called The Light Princess. I don't know if you guys have read this. It's absolutely, it's a masterpiece, and it's just I won't get into too much, but she's cursed by her evil aunt, and she doesn't experience gravity, right? That's why she's called the Light Princess. She floats around, and the parents are always having to grab her from rose bushes, and she gets stuck on the ceiling and all this stuff. But of course, it's symbolic of the fact that she takes everything super lightly. She doesn't realize the seriousness of life, and she kind of lives in her own little world where she can't empathize with other people and all these different things. She discovers when she gets into the lake that she experiences gravity a little bit, and when she's in the lake she becomes something more like a person, like she's more like other people, where she can empathize and she realizes the seriousness of situations. But the whole thing comes to a head when a prince, the lake is draining, and he feels bad for her because this is the only time she really experiences what it is to be human. So he puts himself in the bottom of the lake in the hole that's draining, and he's going to die for her in order to so that she can have this lake, because it's the only thing she loves. Well, at that moment, because she didn't realize it, but she had kind of fallen in love with the prince. She actually wants to save him more than she wants to save the lake, and in doing that, it breaks the curse.
Right? Because she learns.
So in the gift of self, she actually experiences herself as a person really for the first time. She's not this sui generis type of being that doesn't experience anybody else, but herself. She was so substantially her own that she had no relationships, if you could put it that way. And in this relationship, she gains a substantiality, which is kind of
gosh, that is so good. That is so true. And I think it relates to if I may move. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Rodney, if you were not done.
I'm done. That was it. Yep.
Okay. This relates to this next point you're making in here, Dave, about how for Wojtyła, there is no either or. It's not a zero-sum game, so that the more I give myself away, the less I am. It's actually the reverse of that. And I want to go back to our conversation, about little kids, suddenly developing ego boundaries at, say, age 2 or whatever it is, me, my, and then which is why in terms of childhood development, those years are so terribly important, where you hope to instill in the child the sense that your sense of self, your ego boundary should involve concern for the other. I often heard criticism from my students, because Mother Teresa, we all act out of self-interest, and Mother Teresa was just acting out of that's true. But the question is, why did Mother Teresa identify her self-interest with the needs of radical service to the other, whereas this guy down the street associates self-interest with the spirit of acquisition? And then, of course, we hit adolescence, and all of a sudden now the desire is to destroy the ego boundary in many ways. In many ways, what is romance if not suddenly an attempt to literally spill out of oneself, right, towards the other, and have this almost osmosis of persons, and you spend the rest of your life seeking that kind of communion with others, as precisely your deepest self-interest. Now I'm kind of meandering here, but you get my point, that this is what Wojtyła was talking about here.
Well, and it's really interesting to connect that with what Rodney was saying. I mean, you do
exactly. That's my point.
It's one thing in this kind of spontaneous, constantly kind of immediate sort of way, spilling over your boundaries. It's another thing to gather the whole of yourself up and in a deliberate act say yes. That then accomplishes it in a sort of perfect way. And what's so interesting about that is that's when you actually get out of yourself completely, because it's definitive, it's accomplished. And yet, I mean, as Rodney was saying, you feel like that was the most adult thing I've ever done. It's not that I've become now radically dependent, like an infantilized child. But I've actually been able to come into my own. But I come into my own by becoming the own of another. I mean, it's such an extraordinary thing. But so for all I had wondered if there was some tension in Wojtyła, and how could I have overlooked the fact that the only thing that he quotes more often than GS22 is GS24, right? And I mean, right there, it's just over and over again. God created us for our own sake. And that's why we can only exist. We can only find fulfillment by giving ourselves away. I mean, which would seem to be a contradiction. Do we exist for our own sake or for others? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, because Gaudium et Spes 24, I mean, quotes Gospel of John. Jesus says, that we praise, Father, that all may be one as we are one. So there's an intrinsic constitutive tying together of the internal life of the Trinity with the exact kind of dynamic he's expecting out of us.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Rodney, too, go ahead.
Well, and that's why that you realize too, there's no tension with God's ownership. I mean, this is why it's entirely an expression of both God's gift and God's ownership. God, we belong to God precisely by belonging to others and so forth. I mean,
it's a basic print. I mean, C.S. Lewis called it the principle of the dipper and the bucket, which is you dip into the bucket, take water out, you have less and less water. But love is not like that.
Yeah.
Love is you the more water you take out, the more the bucket keeps filling.
That's right. That's right.
But that's such a great story, right? And the Chesterton thing that you brought up, that is just, I think so, because it points to, in many ways, the essence of what ails us is the spirit of acquisition, the spirit of grasping, versus, like you said, more interested in saving than the lake. And so then the spell is broke. I'm reminded of the old lady in Dostoevsky, my onion. And then, down she goes back into hell because she wanted to grasp better onion. And I know your father talked a lot about this too, Dave, that the juxtaposed the spirit of receptivity.
Right.
Vis-a-vis the spirit of grasping and acquisition. And receptivity is the flip side of this notion of gift.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, I was thinking as Rodney was speaking of the McDonald's story of the unbearable lightness of being, which in a way has the same resolution, although I wouldn't give that to your young students to read. It's sort of the same. That's what it is, the unbearable lightness of being that then finally becomes bearable when it's it becomes substantial in a proper gift of self. And the flip side, and this is I think one of the signs of a failure to grasp the essential point is in this temptation, which I think we see all over the place, even even in circles of very insightful theologians and so forth. When they speak of self, when we talk about self-gift, we tend to think of our giving ourselves to another, like this is a gift that's coming from me to another person. And that seems to be the most generous, but it seems to me it's really crucial to see that the deepest meaning of self-gift is that we are first a gift of ourselves to ourselves. And because we have received ourselves, we can go out and give ourselves. So the deepest meaning of self-gift is actually receiving ourselves from the other, which we see in the child. And so that the receptivity is a much more radical dimension of the meaning of gift. And that this is one thing I do think that there is some ambiguity. If you read Person and Act, you don't get a sense of this so much, the receptivity dimension with the child. But in some of the later texts that I try to bring out in the essay here in Familiaris Consortio and this really beautiful meditation on gift that we published in Communio a few years back from John Paul II. That's one of my favorite texts of all time by the Pope.
Which I've never read. Now your article has spurred me on to go read it.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's amazing. It was left unpublished, and I think that there was a French translation that came out, and then we translated it from the French. But this English translation is one of the first publications.
Okay, and for the sake of my viewers, what is the title of the work?
It's called meditation on givenness.
That's right. Okay. I was
And, yeah,
rapidly flowing through here.
and that this
Meditation and givenness. Yeah.
people can find it on the Communio website. I don't have the
That's
precise.
fine. No, that's fine. But believe me, people listen to this podcast and they take down names of books and articles that
Yeah,
get mentioned here.
that's a really short thing. It's something worth, as an Advent meditation, absolutely perfect.
That's great. Um,
One thing that comes to mind real quick, Larry, if
oh,
you
go
don't
ahead.
mind.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
David was talking about the priority of being given.
Yeah.
Right. It's that's precisely, it seems to be, what both the devil and Eve reject, right? They don't want to have been given themselves, because then if you acknowledge that, you have to say thanks.
Yeah.
Right? Which is precisely, so that's why they then can't make a gift of themselves.
That's right.
To other people. Yeah.
Yeah, and gratitude, I'm glad you connected it with gratitude. That really is the expression of this receiving yourself, even.
Yeah.
And when you really enter into the core of it, you begin to see, and this is something it's been endlessly fascinating to me. And it's one of the things I love about Dionysius the Areopagite, also known as Pseudo Dionysius, but his such a profound sense of eros, that which is desire for the other, that he attributes to God. And you think, well, how in the world is that possible? Well, it's possible because desiring the other turns out to be the most extraordinary act of generosity. You actually give yourself most fully to another when you desire the other. If you were to give something to someone and say, you know what, I'm completely indifferent to you. You have nothing to give to me. Here's some money. Here's some. That's humiliating. And that's not really generous. Right. But if you say, I have nothing to give, all I can give is my desire for what you are, and think about that. That's a totally different sort of thing. And when you recognize that kind of reception of the other as an act of generosity, you can see why you can ascribe it to God, but then you also see why this is essential to the meaning of being simply.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, as I was reading, this might take us on a tangent as well. As you were speaking, I'm reminded of that when I was reading this article. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately is the unbelievable importance to human nature, and therefore to God's plan for us, the unbelievable importance of mediation.
Yeah.
That the very essence of being a material being. What different? I had students that would often ask me, why didn't God just make more angels? Why did he make material human beings? And my answer would be, well, because angels experience God more immediately, whereas human beings, being material in existence, the whole point to materiality is the accentuation of mediation. I mean, when you think about it, there's absolutely nothing about us that isn't mediated into us.
That's right.
Even Aquinas, all knowledge comes through the senses, and even that goes through a process of conversion to the phantasm and all that kind of stuff, right?
Well, I mean, it's the distinctive mark of Christianity, which I think we forget. This is the one thing that really is a stumbling block to so many people. Why do you need a priest? Why can't you just immediately connect to God in your and you realize, and that's not obvious, the answer to that question, but when you start to explore it, you realize it's the key to everything. Absolutely everything. Why did God not just save us from heaven? Why did he enter into the flesh in the incarnation? Why was he born of Mary, of a woman? Why the church? You start to realize it's absolutely the central mystery of existence, is that we receive things always through another, rather than have it and possess it immediately. That's a beautiful thought.
No, it's very deeply tied up with humility, kenosis, self-divestment, because it takes, and what really prompted me, and when you were talking just now, was this notion of, I love you best when I actually desire you. That's the greatest gift that I can give you, is that a desire that, in other words, our desires, when properly ordered, are expressive of a profound act of kenotic humility on our part.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's so interesting. If you look over the history of thought, the ancients were nervous about eros, a desire. So if you compare like the ancient concern about desire and the modern concern, sort of post-Reformation modern concern, the ancients were concerned about desire because it implied the loss of self. Desire means
very interesting.
yeah, the desire means that you're dependent on something outside of yourself, and so you're subordinate to whereas in the modern sense we think that desire is bad because it's selfish, it's too much self. And I think the ancients have it right. I mean, one can it seems to me that the key there is the Reformation that we could go into details there, but I think it's
well,
a
yeah, and that's
radical
why
transformation of the meaning of love.
that's why the song by the execrable song by John Lennon, Imagine, really is the song of our culture and our times, because the essence of that song, the message is, if we just didn't give a shit about anything, then we'd have world peace.
Yeah, that's right. Right, and just think about how radically anti-Christian that is. I mean, just nihilistic. Yeah.
Imagine there's no heaven, no nations, no nothing. Just breakfast with Yoko apparently, and the whole world will be fine. It's really, you're right. It's a very nihilistic song, very nihilistic. But it's the anthem of our time.
But I think it's good to recover in recognizing that at the heart of what desire is an affirmation of the other and one's dependence on the other, and that is a kind of a kenotic, generous, loving act, so that we can actually in a way deepen our love precisely by being more true, you might say, to desire.
Yeah. And that the essence of sin is that spirit of acquisition. I mean, the sense that the essence of Adam and Eve's sin was the desire to short circuit the process of mediation by grasping an immediacy.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it was the spirit of acquisition rather than passive, not passive, but a sort of
and therefore not really having to desire. That's the thing. It's short circuiting desire as well. So it's immediate. You can alleviate the pain of desire as quickly as possible. A really fascinating read in this context is Brave New World, where I mean that's in a certain sense you think of it as like all desires kind of let loose, but that's not in fact. I mean the idea is to eliminate desire because of the children should never have to suffer through an ungratified desire, for more than 1 second.
Hey, that sounds like me. The older I get, and Rodney, I'm going to let you chime in a second, but I'm serious about something. I have noticed I'm so thankful that I didn't grow up in the era of the internet, that I grew up in the era of books and so on and so forth, because I've noticed ever since I possessed one of these obnoxious things that my own attention span has gotten less and less and less and less and less.
That's right.
And so I just like, well, geez. I asked, do I ever really desire anything anymore? Or is it just flitting from one immediacy to another? It's really strange. But anyway, Rodney, you go ahead.
I mean, right, but can I just
sure, no,
desire as a path to sanctity. I mean, that's the thing. You realize that there is a kind of a purification that desire itself offers us, which is an extraordinary thing. Sorry.
No, that's interesting.
No, I was just thinking that kind of it's interesting to me always to realize how sort of intuitively even decent parents, they get this stuff at a very basic level. Because like even just your ordinary simple parents like mine, when I was little, would desire my help. Or desire to be a part of things, right? Even though it was made their lives more complicated, because usually when they asked me to do something, I didn't do it as well as they would have done it. But they kind of instinctively know that you need to be desired, right? And they're being generous in desiring your help. It's not really helping them, right? But they really do desire it, because someday you are going to end up taking care of them. right? I mean, that, it's kind of interesting, but they're training you for that, right? From the time you're two, practically. Yeah.
And it's a way of affirming you and your being
Yep.
rather than just treating you as an object in the household or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does point too to a fundamental difference between Christianity and Catholicism in particular. And I don't want to engage in straw man caricatures, but any religious expression of radical apophaticism,
That's right.
that the cataphatic moment, the apophatic moment is a moment within a cataphatic, broader descent of love into our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And the radical kind of ascetic thing that you detach yourself from your desires, and that's how you achieve a kind of salvation.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're back to John Lennon.
Yeah, we are. And it's something that I never cottoned up to. I'll tell you, when I was in seminary, and every once in a while, you'd run into a really old fashioned spiritual director or priest that would talk about, true sanctity involves, the complete elimination of all desires for anything other than God. And I knew even then, no, it means chastening our desires and channeling them so that all that I desire leads to God.
Yeah.
Once again, the concept of mediation, not to eliminate. I mean, because I tell you what, you try to eliminate all desire, and so that you'll only desire God, you're going to end up hating God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's a really,
because that means God is just a gigantic jerk in the sky. What's that Billy Joel song? I'm about songs tonight. Only the good die young. And I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. Isn't that the Billy Joel line? That's the popular image that kind of a God conjures up, right? Like the perpetual buzzkill and wet blanket in the sky. But anyway, I digress. I want to move on a bit here. And it's related to this, though. In the article, you make a point about, is self gift a merely moral act, or is it an ontological thing? And I go back to what you said before about, it's not just, as ego boundaries go, that's not just spilling out; it's the gathering up into a single act of giving. Like I think of Mary's fiat, the perfect gathering up of not just herself, but the entirety of the covenant, and saying yes to God in this gathered up act, which was ontic. It was ontological and not merely a moral act. Or am I getting my Mariology wrong?
No, I think that's exactly that's exactly the point. And that's why, I think we all know the difference between giving, in a superficial way, that you're just sort of forcing yourself to do something, and it's not coming from your depths, as opposed to a gift that comes from your depths. And how do you articulate that? One way is to say that, as Wojtyła does in Person and Act, that the act, your action, actually has its roots in your being, essay.
Yes.
And if it has its roots in your being, it even in a certain sense goes beyond your deliberate control. It's something that wells up within you. Now you clearly have perfect freedom in a way, recapitulating and consenting to the movement that is already welling up, but it's not simply a function of your deliberate act. Because I think if you think of your activity as simply the result of your choice, it's always going to take this superficial form. If you realize that the choice that you make is already a movement that is already afoot, as it were, in your being.
Yeah.
It has a different sort of substance.
Right.
To come back to that language.
Well,
just an
go ahead, Rod. No, go ahead.
As a professor, and I think I'm sure you guys have had this too, is sometimes you'll get an email from a student, that's asking a really good question.
Yeah.
That comes from something you talked about in class or whatever. And if everything's, been going the way it ought to be, you have to answer it. Kind of, you're obligated as a professor to give an answer, but it doesn't feel like that. It actually, you're so glad that somebody's interested in this stuff you're talking about. And then it's so fun to be able to give them more, like, you know what I mean? Like more explanation, more answers, et cetera, et cetera. So that it's not like, oh, I'm obliged to answer this. It's like, I can't wait almost to answer it in some cases.
Yeah. Well, isn't that, I mean, it's that's another example of the point that we were making. The student has a desire for what you are teaching. And that in itself, you know, that you don't experience this as, oh, here's yet another thing, obligation being laid on me. You experience it as an affirmation of, you know, the goodness of your teaching, which isn't, you know, not, oh, I'm so great as a teacher, but the stuff that I'm teaching is good. It's beautiful. I get so excited. You know, it's not mine, it's ours. And you're so excited to, you know, and that desire then increases it. I mean, so this would be the what was it with the cup and the bucket, you know? The
dipper in the bucket.
Yeah, the very desire for it actually increases it. That's an extraordinary thing that we all experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but it goes to this point too about the distinction between the moral and the ontic being somewhat of a false distinction. Yeah, I remember those moments too. So I still get them, as you know, this people write to me too because of this crazy blog, you know, like blah blah blah. What's going on here with this and that? And the other. Anyway, and of course, yeah, you're thrilled. Oh, an opportunity to expound more. But there's also a part of you, if you're honest, would say, I don't really have time for this right now. And you know, gosh, I don't have a half an hour to sit down and type out 18 paragraphs, a miniature essay for one person. And so, but you do it. You do it because there's an awareness of not just something moral, but something deeper, something ontological. You are aware that there are consequences both for that person and for me that are ontological and not merely moral. I'm thinking that the moral and ontological distinction in our actions, when held strictly, leads to probably a rather juridical and forensic understanding. And to this extent, I'm critical of old-fashioned Thomistic faculty psychology that you know would talk about, well, this was simply these emotions are mere, you know, accidents of this particular virtue and not really ontologically grounded. And it was just a way of really distancing our actions further and further from our ontological core, it seems to me.
And making it all superficial. No, the sense is I am serving something bigger than myself. And that's why you do it. And I mean, you know, and that's the thing again, that also makes it more mine.
Well, you know, so, exactly.
All go together.
And but I also want to bring in that personal dimension too. That it means, once again, to drag in, Lewis said, you know, you never meet a mere mortal. And you never, I mean, we've all had this experience too, where a student that you taught 25 years ago will write to you that you had no idea, you don't remember their name, nothing, and say, you know, one time, Dr. Chapp, you met me in the hallway and you said this to me and it changed my life.
Wow.
And you realize, and we've all had those experiences, and not just teachers. Every human being has had those experiences where you never know. You absolutely never know. A little old lady you meet in the grocery store who maybe is thinking of committing suicide that day because her husband just died, and you offer her a kind word and help getting something off a shelf, and she in that moment decides, no, I'm not going to kill myself today. These are moments we won't know until the next life, you know. And obviously I'm way off topic here. We're not talking so much about Wojtyła's person and act and so forth here, but it does relate to the fact that these our actions follow from our very being, and therefore self-gift has got to come from my core, it seems to me.
That's right.
So anyway, Rodney, did you want to?
Well, just maybe to kind of get a little bit farther into the thing, it seems to me that we've dealt with the kind of, I have kind of in my notes here, there were kind of three takeaways after you kind of unpack the thing. And the first one was the idea that we've just been talking about, that it's not just a sort of conscious act of the will, but it actually is already undertaken ontically, and that which then comes to expression when we make a gift of ourselves. So that's kind of, I like that. I like the second one. I would like you to clarify, if you don't mind. So I would just like to read what you say and then maybe have you clarify it, if that's cool.
That always makes me nervous.
No, I think I understand it, but I would like to hear you kind of elaborate.
You know what makes me nervous when people do this is that I never remember what it was I wrote, and then what in the hell I meant by it, and the person that's quoting it to me knows it better than I do.
Yeah, and if you can't answer it, that's fine. That'll be fun too. No, I'm kidding.
Go ahead, Rodney. Go ahead.
So you say, second, because the deliberate movement of the will draws, so to speak, on a source that lies deeper than itself, namely being, it takes up into itself the factors of its existential condition. This means that the act of the will integrates positively into itself the promptings from things that lie outside of itself, the motions stirred in it by what is other. These include, for example, the essentially passive or better receptive movements of desire, like a response to values, the passions or emotions, and the whole world of what lies below the sphere of explicit consciousness. These things all contribute to an activity that is already underway in the self prior to one's self-enactment.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have that underlined too. I was going to ask him, so that's great.
That's a really interesting passage, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean that's language that's not sort of normal for me, but I picked up from Person and Act.
Okay,
those are very much Wojtyła's. Because he was engaging with some thinkers in psychology and even in the scientific realm, sort of the positive sciences.
Right.
But the basic point, I mean, in a certain sense, it touches, it ties into things that we were just talking about. I've always found it interesting to consider one aspect of Aquinas's anthropology in his treatment of the will. He explains that the object of the will is an object of appetite. So that's another way of saying desire. Yeah. And he describes at one point the object of desire as an unmoved mover of our desire. And what's so interesting is you realize that my act of will actually doesn't begin from me. It actually begins from the thing that I'm going to will. It's that is moving me to move myself to approach it. And that's why there's really a profound intimacy with the world that goes on in any given act of will. And I think that the text that you just read, I was drawing on some aspects in Wojtyła as a really profound sense of that. What is a passion? We tend not to use the language of passion these days. We use the language of emotion typically, and they're actually they're almost the opposite. I read a book, I can't remember the author's name, who traced the development of this language and said that the language of emotion replaced the language of passion precisely when a secularized anthropology was sort of hitting the scene, that it's actually when we lose the religious dimension. So what's an emotion? Emotion is emotion from, it's movement from within, whereas a passion is undergoing something from without. And in a passion, we're being moved by the things in the world. And it's precisely in the energy, you might say, of these things moving us that we have the energy to move ourselves. And that's not deterministic at all. I mean, we can move ourselves and we can join or not. Right. But when we join, what we're doing is recapitulating in ourselves a movement that's already underway and that has been begun by things outside of us. And so, what Freud, when he talks about the unconscious, that's a subjectivizing of all of this, and it's thinking of it as layers of consciousness. What you have in Wojtyła is incorporating some of the things that you would associate with the unconscious, but recognizing that the reason it's as unconscious is because it's ontological, and it's beginning with reality moving itself in me. It's not like simply the hidden depths of some secret place in my head, in this really narrow sense. So that's the point there, to recognize that. Think of our free choice and activity as something like the peak of an iceberg, the tip of an iceberg, that's that floats precisely because of the ontological depth of its reality below.
Yeah, that's good.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. That's rich.
Along those lines, perhaps you could talk about, when you talk about the law of gift, you discuss what you mean by the word law. So maybe you could unpack that a little bit as well.
Oh, that's another the ancient modern thing. I'm always going back to that, but I mean, here it's really beautiful to read and study more, and this is something I'd like to learn more about myself, but the Hebrew understanding of what the law of God is, what law means. um you have a purely sort of extrinsicist view in somebody like Kant, who thinks of Kant is actually even more complicated. But let's just say it's sort of a modern view of the law is a prescription that's given to you from the outside. It's just imposed. It's essentially coercive, and it simply tells you what to do. But it seems to me a deeper sense of the law that you get in the Greeks and the Jews, and this is what's taken up into Christianity, is that the law itself enters into me to liberate my capacity to fulfill it. That's part of the meaning of the law that's written in our hearts. It's the law itself enables.
Yeah.
So it's not like we force ourselves to do something in conformity to an extrinsic measure. By loving the law and internalizing it, we actually acquire a certain capacity to fulfill it.
Yeah.
So that would be contrary to the notion of law as something completely heteronomous.
That's right.
Right. And it's interesting. It's always been interesting to me, which is why I wanted you to comment. I mean, there's this dialectic between a sense of morality as utterly autonomous
Yeah.
and utterly heteronomous. That those
right.
two things play off of one another.
They're flip sides of the same coin. They seem to be opposites, but they always turn out to be flip sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really do. Rodney, do you want to say something?
No, I was just thinking about how great athletes, like when you start a sport, the things that you're supposed to do feel so unnatural, right? They're like, keeping your left arm straight when you're hitting a drive in golf, or something like that. It just seems like, well, wait a second, I'd do better if I bent my, and all that stuff. But then you see the great athletes, they've so interiorized the rules of the game that they always do it that way because they know from inside it's the better way, right?
Yeah, but Arnold Palmer really ruins that analogy.
There's always exceptions that prove the rule.
Yeah, the world's worst swing in terms of classic swings, and yet he was one of the greatest golfers. But I'm just being joking.
You're out of my realm here. If we can bring it to, if you can use a football analogy,
David, we don't want our quarterbacks throwing off their back foot during our games.
That's right.
We want them stepping into the throw.
There you go.
Well, then you had great quarterbacks like Kenny Stabler, who sidearmed everything, right? Sonny Jurgensen sidearmed everything. Yeah. So I mean, it works somehow. But your point is, I'm being a pain here, but it's so true. I mean, the virtues play into this, obviously, and so you've got the moral equivalent of muscle memory and all those sorts of things. But okay, following up on Rodney's last quote, where he quoted sort of the second point of three. And as for you, I'd like you to elaborate where you say, third, even the physical reality of the body has a proper and indeed indispensable place in human action. Yeah. It is well known that Wojtyła emphasizes the transcendence of the person in action, which is to say the person's self-possessive capacity to determine himself over and above all other contributing determinations, which I think is really, really interesting. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit.
Yes, I mean, so there are two parts of that quote, but the thing about the transcendence.
Yeah, well, I ended quickly, but you you want me to finish it,
Yeah,
or you?
please. Yeah, yeah, please, because I
Okay,
don't
yeah.
remember it, and I don't know where I was going with that.
Okay. That's what I was talking about earlier, when I'm always nervous when somebody quotes me, because like, okay, why the hell did I write that? And above all other contributing determinations, apart from the determination of truth itself, which always remains absolute, that is, that to which the rest is relative, in parentheses. But the sign of this transcendence, as Wojtyła conceives it, is precisely the integration of the whole of man, body, and soul, down to his very being, esse, in the person's action. Thus, though body is radically distinct from spirit, it is not left outside of spiritual action as a merely external factor, even one that imposes itself as indispensable. It seems to me that this is the very foundation for the whole theology of the body.
It is. And no, that's, I mean, in a way, it's a simple point, but once you see that, there's so much that,
Yeah.
I mean, and it bears on so many other kinds of things. But, we typically think of transcendence as leaving behind what is transcended. So, if human beings have a spiritual dimension, we most see that when they deny the body, when they're able to do things, when somebody's able to, in a way, deny his animal bodily needs, because only something that transcends the body can do that. And what's so interesting there, I mean, actually, at a profound level, that leaves in place a kind of an opposition between spirit and body. That means that they have to be sort of the same order so that they can compete with each other, which actually means that you've denied the transcendence of spirit. I mean, in a kind of
Yeah.
fancy philosophical way, you realize that you're actually denying transcendence and exaggerating it in this way. But what's so interesting in Wojtyła, it's a fairly simple point, but you best see the transcendence of the spirit when you see it gathering the whole up with it and taking it along, rather than in acting against it. And
Yeah.
this note, that's another huge theme, really prominent and essential theme in a lot of his writings, especially his philosophical writings and anthropological writings, is this sense of integration, the unity of the person, body and soul together. This whole gathering up of the whole person in one's acts. That's sort of a trademark of Wojtyła, and I think a kind of a beautiful reminder of what transcendence properly means.
Wow, that's very profound. That's really interesting. The idea that if we denigrate the importance of the material
Mm-hmm.
bodiliness on the grounds that, well, it's just like a snake shedding its skin, it's just something we get rid of, you're actually denigrating transcendence, because what exactly is being transcended here? Nothing. And yet it's more, I mean, once again, to drag C.S. Lewis, one of my in here, in that little short essay he has in The Weight of Glory called Transposition, where he talks about all of it's essentially, at least like Russian nesting dolls, right? All of existence is about the lower being taken up into the higher. And when it is taken up into the higher, you begin to see what the ultimate purpose of the lower actually was.
Yeah.
The lower becomes more itself as it's taken up into the higher.
Yeah.
And that's Lewis's concept of transposition, which I think I see in Wojtyła here as well.
Absolutely. No, that's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, I'm glad you agree. That's good, because that's one of my actually, Rodney and I attended a C.S. Lewis conference in Oxford many years ago. Remember that, Howsare? And I actually gave a paper on Lewis's. It's one of my favorite essays of Lewis's. It's very short, and yet I think absolutely.
I recall loving that book many years ago, but it's been many years. I need to reread it. But that theme that you emphasized there, that was my mentor at Catholic U, Eric Pearl, the Neoplatonist. I mean, that was a theme that he would often touch on, and I just found it really eye-opening. And it's amazing to have someone present that as Platonic thought, because that's not, we tend to think of Plato as, exactly what we've been criticizing, but he's not.
Oh,
And C.S. Lewis understood that too. And the great Neoplatonists understood that.
Yeah, Lewis was something of a Christian Platonist. Yeah, but yeah, I remember I was fed a steady diet of the divided line, and
Yeah.
Plato was an anti-cosmic dualist, and and it's hogwash when you read the dialogues. Like,
Yeah.
that's not the Plato that I was taught, for crying out loud. And of course, I mean, I'm going to have a plug for your book on Plato, David, is just phenomenal. And anybody that is out there that wants to read a great piece of secondary literature on Plato, then you need to get what's the exact title of your book again?
Plato's Critique of Impure Reason.
Impure. I remember the impure reason part, but I couldn't remember Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and it's still out there for sale, folks. So go out and purchase it because
I think that will always be my favorite thing that I've done, actually.
Well, actually, when it right after it first came out was when I was at that conference in Krakow.
Right.
Yeah. And
we saw each other.
We always but I remember I was having dinner with a bunch of other people, Tracy Rowland included, with William Desmond, and Desmond had high praise for your. I hadn't read it yet, and the reason why I read it was William Desmond said, "Man, you got to get Schindler's book on Plato." So
that's great. He's joining us this coming semester. He's going to teach a couple of classes, so he'll be in town.
Oh wow! Yeah. I knew that he was at Villanova quite a bit.
That's right, and and I think that's coming to an end. And he's planning to retire. But we were able to persuade him to come with the David L. Schindler Fellowship. We've had.
Oh, that's great.
One professor before, so he'll be the second one to do a semester.
When he retires, is he going to retire to Belgium or is he?
Good question. He's lived in Belgium for so many years. I'll find out when he's here.
Okay, very good.
But I think he's also got family, in Ireland.
In Ireland. I only ask for selfish reasons. I hope he sticks around. We should probably wrap this up. We've kind of gone through most of the article, and we've been at this for about an hour and 20 minutes. Rodney, do you have any last questions?
I don't think so. I think we did a pretty good job of sort of wrapping it up. I mean, the very final thing that is, I think would be important here is just to talk about how this all comes to a head, so to speak, or comes to a conclusion in the states of life, where you finally, vow it. And it's interesting because this is a perfect illustration of your point, is that it's kind of there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. When I always tell my students, when you say I love you to a woman for maybe the first time in the relationship, you sit down and you say, hey, I have something to tell you. I think I'm in love with you. Right. You would never say for now. Right. That would take the romantic thing or and your roommate.
Yeah.
Right. So I tell that to my students all the time, and they get a big kick out of it. But they also are like, "That's true. Like that wouldn't be very romantic to say I love you for now. That's not even there. Like in just the early stages, that just doesn't make any sense, right? So,
no.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually I've seen some wedding vows. I've been to some weddings where it's like, I pledge my loyalty and fidelity to you for as long as our love shall last.
And it ain't love.
Yeah. And what do you mean by that? Well, it's kind of interesting. Everybody likes the idea of love as gift, and loves the language of gift, talking about love. But it's interesting. I remember, at the Institute, our students here have already, they're already pretty committed to these ideas. So we don't have to, we can actually think about things. We don't have to persuade them of anything, which is a really nice place to be. But in my previous position, we spent all of our time trying to persuade the students about something. Yes. But I remember they were very happy with the idea about love and gifts, and then I said, and then you have to wait until they forget that they kind of affirm that, and then ask them about the difference between a gift and a loan. And they say, well, yeah, and I said, what if you give something and then you take it back later? Then they said, yeah, no, that's not a gift. Anyway, all that, then you have to return it and you say, okay, so if love is gift, that means that it has to be permanent, once and for all, definitive, eternal. And they say, whoa, wait a minute. But, it's obviously true once you make that connection.
Wow. Very true.
Yeah.
And now I need to go to confession.
We all do. That's what Advent's for.
Yeah. Well, I need to go to confession, I guess, for a lot of reasons. But I'll just add that. I'll add that to the list. Hey, but anyway, I plugged your book on Plato. There's also your book, The Politics of the Real, which is the last book of yours I've read. You probably have more. You probably have 18 books since that one, but I can't keep up. You're like Matt Levering. You're cranking out a book every 3 weeks.
He's outdone me many times over.
I had dinner with Scott Hahn last week because I was in Steubenville taping the Matt Fradd show. I'm not name dropping. It's just true. I had dinner with Scott Hahn, and he was giving us a tour of the new St. Paul Center. And he was showing me all of his, all the books that he's written. Yeah. And I brought up Matt Levering, and he goes, nobody can keep up with Matt.
That's very true.
Nobody can keep up with Matt. Matt's a great guy. So Matt, if you're listening, God bless you, buddy. Anyway, Dave, thanks for coming on today. This has been great.
Thanks, and, Larry. I always love. We need to get you back in town for some reason, but get you both back in town.
Absolutely.
The Larry and Rodney show together again.
You should come down to act with me this year, Larry.
Well, I tried last year, but
this coming year,
there was no room at the inn.
Wow.
I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
There was no room at the inn. We'll talk.
Well, there's always room at our place, as you know. But
that wasn't the issue. But anyway, you guys are really pushing me here. I'm trying to be polite. All right. And hey, thanks, Dave, for coming on. Thanks again, Rodney, and thanks everyone for listening. Bye now.